I'll never forget the first time I was in Prince Rupert. I saw ships loaded with raw logs heading for export. I suppose it was a little naive to be surprised at that. After all, we sell all kinds of other raw goods. But somehow shiploads of logs that hadn't even been run through a sawmill just didn't seem right. To me, it symbolized what BC has been doing with its forest. For years, British Columbia has cut more area than it's reforested. I don't know all the reasons for that, but foresters who aren't afraid to speak out say political favoritism and industry and government short-sightedness are two big ones. Professor Les Reed of the University of British Columbia is one who says forest management in all of Canada, except for Alberta, has generally been a failure. Reed is a non-academic who earned his position as Special Industrial Professor of Forest Research by way of a distinguished career in the Canadian Forestry Service. A lot of everyday industry and government foresters aren't very fond of Reed because they think he's only interested in sustaining forest yield. They point out that there are other considerations, like the economic health of the industry. After all, in order to survive, companies have to make a profit. If the government makes the reforesting regulations too stiff and the costs too high, the climate won't be right for industry anymore, and of course that will hurt the economy. The problem, Reed points out, is that by keeping the economic climate right, BC has fallen behind in its reforestation program by more than 1 million hectares, roughly 5 times the yearly harvest. Of course, there are so many trees in BC that it really doesn't matter all that much, or so the government thought until the 70s, when it took a little more refined peek at what was really left and found there was 25% less than it thought. That meant that by as early as the 1990s, logging might have to be cut to half what it was in the 70s to keep from wiping out the forest industry entirely. But the recession of the early 80s hit BC hard. Again, in order to keep the economy viable, regulation enforcement was relaxed a little, and soon we were seeing television shows about high grading and other wasteful practices in BC's beleaguered forest. Even then, 9 major forest companies lost more than $200 million in 1983 and 4. But 85 was a turnaround year, where those same companies made almost $60 million profit. With the weak Canadian dollar in the last few years, Canada has managed to take a bigger piece of the American softwood market, too. We now supply 34% of that market, and BC is one of the major suppliers. In fact, 80% of BC's $8 billion forestry business depends on the Americans. That has the American forestry people all upset, and looking for some protection from Washington to keep BC lumber out. They say BC is charging its forest companies so little stumpage, the amount the company pays the government for the right to cut the trees, that it amounts to a subsidy, and that's not fair. Naturally, BC is denying that charge and praying that Washington won't cave into the American forest lobby before Canada and the U.S. reach some kind of free trade agreement. Meanwhile, BC is busy cutting, sawing, and shipping to the U.S. to keep its share of that lucrative market, and the BC forest is losing out a little more. What I'm afraid of is that the BC forest industry will keep reaping more than it sows until it doesn't matter whether the Americans close the border. There won't be enough trees to meet the demand anyway. The picture isn't entirely depressing, though. Last year, BC and the federal government did decide to put $300 million into reforesting the backlog of cutover areas over the next 5 years. At the start, at least. But Reed says it's still not enough to solve the problem entirely. Too bad BC isn't like Finland. That country cuts almost as many trees as BC, but it plants 2.5 times as many seedlings and spends a lot more time and effort grooming and looking after its forest. Alberta has a good forestry record too, but that's because of a couple of renegade foresters back in the 50s who pushed some regulations through legislature calling for sustained yield harvesting, reforesting as much as you cut. Alberta companies seem to be as competitive as anywhere else. I imagine BC could do the same thing if it wanted to. I'm Noel McNaughton.